Welcome back to Palestine Bookshelf. I'm Stephen Heiner, and today we're going to be discussing Perfect Victims and the Politics of Appeal by Mohammed El-Kurd. This book was published in February of 2025. An interesting story of how I got to this book was through a recommendation from one of our subscribers to watch a documentary called My Neighborhood. A 12-year-old Mohammed El-Kurd was in this documentary, and then I got digging and wondering what happened to him, hoping he hadn't been killed, and finding out this book. What can I say about this? Wow is how I would start. It's eloquent, it's thoughtful, it's really necessary, and I want to give you a taste of the quality just to start before we dig into the rest of the book. And the snipers are everywhere. The underhanded journalists, the spineless bureaucrats, the inconspicuous henchmen, the philanthropists who mine our tragedies for gold, the television anchors who obfuscate those tragedies, the missionaries who find their salvation in our demise, the devil's advocates, the distractors, those who litter our roads with red herrings, the unscrupulous political advisers, the activists who act as puppet masters, the elite capturers, the elitists in our ranks who demand of us a certain dance, who imprison us in the panopticon of their gaze, the self-appointed intellectuals, the clergy who whisper when they should scream, the very well-fed weapons manufacturers and the university administrators who feed them, and the academics indulging in arrogance and willful misrepresentation, who mutilate Frantz Fanon and Walter Benjamin, deny human nature, and contest even the laws of physics in order to pathologize our resistance. In this reality, the sniper's hands are clean of blood, but his body count is insurmountable. Very eloquent. And I know even at the time of the documentary at 12, he was speaking English, but it's probably not his first language. Probably maybe a second language, but just his eloquence is on display, and it's one of the more eloquent English first Palestinian perspectives that I've had a chance to read. And don't let that distract you. There's so much going on here, but the main thesis of the text is that Palestinians are required to pass all kinds of tests by society, by journalism, by the Israelis, in order to have simply permission to narrate their own experience. But they don't need anybody's permission. They are the oppressed. Their voices must be heard. No qualification or interrogation should be necessary or imposed. They are not simply victims. They have agency, they are people, and they need to be heard for who they are. We'll have to start with some context. He gives examples of horror stories, which some of you may have heard. I can say in many of these cases I had not heard of them, but I want to set the stage for talking about other things by leading with some of these unfortunate, horrible stories. Euro-Mediterranean Human Rights Monitor has reported concerns that the Israeli regime has stolen organs from Palestinian corpses, citing medical professionals who have documented evidence of possible organ theft by the Israeli military, which includes missing cochleas and corneas, as well as other vital organs like livers, kidneys, and hearts from bodies of dead Palestinians returned by the Israeli military to southern Gaza. Every time you think you've reached some new low, there's always something below that. To illustrate, when the Israeli occupation forces killed 15-year-old Adam Ayad, and here he gives us this context, Adam Issam Shaker Ayad, 15, was shot and killed by Israeli forces around 4:30 a.m. on January the 3rd, 2023, in the Hisha refugee camp, just outside the city of Bethlehem in the southern occupied West Bank. Israeli forces entered the camp earlier that morning to arrest a Palestinian man. Palestinians confronted Israeli forces, who fired live ammunition, rubber-coated metal bullets, sound bombs, and tear gas canisters at the crowd. Adam sustained at least one gunshot wound to the back of his shoulder. He was transferred to Al Hussein Hospital in nearby Bet Jela in a private car, where doctors pronounced him dead. On December the 6th, 2023, 6 members of the Abu Salah family in Shira, Sadi, and 4 of their children, Mahmoud, Ahmad, Yusuf, and Sur, were waving a white flag when they were shot dead from close range by Israeli occupation forces in northern Gaza. The Abu Salehs were on their way back from burying their teenage relative, Assad, who had been shot in the heart with an explosive bullet by an Israeli sniper just hours before. The Israelis then bulldozed their remains into a pile of garbage. Many Palestinians in Gaza have deployed makeshift white flags in hope of escaping the murderous whims of the occupation forces. In many instances, Palestinians carrying such flags have still been targeted. Even when 3 Israeli hostages used white flags to identify themselves to occupation forces, they were still shot at. Of course, while the Israeli occupation forces do not often admit killing Palestinians waving white flags, it admitted having mistakenly killed the hostages. It's surprising they even admitted that. In August 2023, 16 Israeli police officers turned off their body cameras and branded, as in physically etched, the Star of David into the cheek of 22-year-old Orwa Sheikh Ali, a young man they arrested from the Refaat refugee camp in occupied Jerusalem. Anas Khalil was a Palestinian girl from the village of Sinjil, north of Ramallah. On October the 19th, 2014, Anas was walking home with her friend Tulin Asfour when a settler ran them over with his car, killing Anas and severely wounding Tulin. Anas was 5 years old. Mohammed Al-Dura was a 12-year-old Palestinian boy who was killed by the Israeli occupation forces in the Gaza Strip at the beginning of the Second Intifada. He was shot on September the 30th, 2000, as he crouched behind his father Jamal, in a murder that was broadcast live worldwide. On October the 15th, 2023, Jamal Al-Dura's brothers were killed in an Israeli airstrike on the Gaza Strip, and on January the 18th, 2024, 23 years after killing Muhammad, the Israeli occupation forces killed his brother, Ahmad, in Burej camp in Gaza. Ahmad Manasra is a Palestinian political prisoner from Beit Hanina, occupied Jerusalem. He was arrested in 2015 at 13 years old, accused of partaking in a stabbing against settlers in Piskat Ze'ev, an Israeli settlement in occupied Jerusalem. He was sentenced to 9.5 years in Israeli prison and has been in solitary detention since November 2021. His case has received international coverage for the physical and psychological torture imposed upon him by the Zionist state. Nufuz Hamad is a former political prisoner from Sheikh Jarrah. In 2021, at 14 years old, she was accused of attempting to stab one of the settlers who lived across the street in the Al-Gawi family home, which had been forcibly taken by a government-backed settler organization in 2008. She was sentenced to 12 years in Israeli prison. She was the youngest Palestinian female prisoner in Israeli custody. So, leading with some of those stories to remind us of the people who are dying every day, and those are just a few of the names. Just wanted to make sure that their names are remembered and their stories are told. What is some of the context that Muhammad gives us? We die a lot. We die in fleeting headlines, in between breaths. Our death is so quotidian that journalists report it as though they're reporting the weather. Cloudy skies, light showers, and 3,000 Palestinians dead in the past 10 days. And much like the weather, only God is responsible, not armed settlers, not targeted drone strikes. I am struck by this conundrum in a more profound, almost philosophical sense, a more universal sense, not universal in a way that indulges the capitalist commercial connotations of the world, glossing over power, history, and barbed wire, but a universality that recognizes the Palestinian condition is the human condition. Palestine is a microcosm of the world, wretched, raging, fraught, and fragmented, on fire, stubborn, ineligible, dignified. The lens we lend the Palestinian reveals how we see each other, how we see everything else. Humanization diverts critical scrutiny away from the colonizer and onto the colonized, obscuring the inherent injustice of colonialism, thus shielding the colonial project. In misplacing their focus, advocates, or lawyers, or journalists insinuate that the oppressed must demonstrate their worthiness of liberty and dignity first and foremost. Otherwise, occupation, subjugation, police brutality, dispossession, surveillance, and extrajudicial executions would be excusable or even necessary. In a sense, and he'll go through this theme over and over in the text, Palestinians have to be perfect victims in order to be mentioned. And even then, it doesn't mean that anything will be done. I am tired of the false equivalence between semantic violence and systemic violence. Only one party in this conflict is actively engaged in the intentional and systematic attempted eradication of an entire population. Here he's referencing the idea that a copy of Mein Kampf in Arabic was found in Kibbutz Be'eri, one of the places that was attacked on October the 7th. Probably planted, but even if it wasn't, here's what Muhammad is trying to say. At first, it may seem shocking how a tale so ridiculous can be so potent and effective. But how many hours have you wasted defending against ad hominem attacks? No, our men are gentle fathers. Or assuaging the paranoias of strawman arguments? No, from the river to the sea is not a secret call to genocide. Or navigating slippery slopes? No, a free Palestine will not lead to a second Holocaust. Or pausing for red herrings? No, there are no tunnels under the hospital. Or appealing to authority? Even the Israeli scholars agree that it is a genocide. Or debunking equivocations? No, anti-Semitism is not anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. The very quality of propaganda, illogic, is precisely its strongest suit, because it is a distraction. And I would say Muhammad has convinced me, along with other people that I've been hearing recently, that our entire life cannot be built around simply defending Hasbra. Firstly, it should be delegated to the people who have the stomach for it and have the passion and ability to do it well. But secondly, it distracts us from doing what we should be doing, which is learning more about who Palestinians are as people, what they aspire to, what they are working on, not simply trying to combat all of the lies. You will drown trying to combat the lies. To be Palestinian today is to feel like you are caught in a fever dream, trapped in someone else's hallucination. It is to be interrogated about the hidden insidiousness of our chants, while Israeli politicians boast about ethnically cleansing Gaza in newspapers and interviews. It is to be shouted over, silenced, by people who claim to fear for their lives from the safety of apartments that have never been blistered by white phosphorus, that have endured nothing fiercer than a U.S. winter, while people in another corner of the planet dig for loved ones buried in the wreck of flattened buildings. Conversations about Palestine in the West are steered by abstractions, about the meaning of Zionism, about the threat level of words, about a logistically impossible, yet impossibly imminent, genocide of the Jewish people. Wait, you're saying children in Gaza are being shot by snipers? A CBS News correspondent asks Dr. Mark Perlmutter, an orthopedic surgeon who has just returned from Gaza. Definitively, he answers. I have 2 children that I have photographs of that were shot so perfectly in the chest, I couldn't put my stethoscope over their heart more accurately. And if children cannot escape Zionist fire, what makes us believe that somehow, by virtue of their age, they escape the dehumanization and racism of the Zionist apparatus that discredits our academics and demonizes our journalists? The sniper lurks not only atop our homes, but in conference rooms and newsrooms, on university campuses, and in hospital corridors. Recently, Netanyahu reportedly advocated for using the temporary pier built by the Pentagon on the shore of Gaza to forcibly transfer Palestinians to other countries. Weeks before that, the Israeli Minister for the Advancement of the Status of Women said to a nodding television anchor, "I don't care about Gaza. I literally don't care. For all I care, they can go out and just swim in the sea. I want to see dead bodies of terrorists around Gaza. That's what I want to see." In 1992, Rabin, the West's beloved soldier of peace, said, "I would like Gaza to sink into the sea." I could flood the next few pages with similar quotes, but you're never going to hear those quotes from the journalists. In the Zionist imagination, we are the aggressors, the invaders. And while Ben-Gurion can say to his disciples, "Let us not ignore the truth among ourselves," politically, we are the aggressors and they defend themselves. The country is theirs. Most Israelis, raised on a different chorus, do ignore the truth among themselves. They believe Palestine is theirs by divine decree, and we, the children of darkness, have stolen it from them. This aphorism, absurd and ahistorical as it may be, is not weakened by the truth. It exists despite it. Those asking what happens to the settlers have not once thought about the fate of the 6 million Palestinian refugees agonizing in exile. This is not so much a polemic, but an observation, a fatigued observation, reiterated incessantly. Such distracting questions feed the discursive loop that prioritizes the settlers' theoretical future over our material present that is already marked with extermination. In the United States, 44% of Jewish students do not feel safe on their own campus. On the other hand, there are no universities left in Gaza because they were all destroyed by the Israeli occupation forces. Something that Mohammed keeps coming back to throughout the book. The book is it's set up as a monologue, but it easily moves back and forth, so we're not moving in a chronological linear fashion. He keeps bringing back themes over and over, and one of the motifs that grows throughout the text is the do you support Hamas trope. And we see it over and over, and he brings it up, and when you read it again, it's so ridiculous, but I appreciate all the examples he offers us. 2 days after October the 7th's Hamas offensive on the Israeli colonies encircling Gaza, the Palestinian Authority's ambassador to the UK gave an interview to the BBC just hours after 6 of his family members had fallen victim to an Israeli airstrike. They were simply bombarded. Their entire building was brought down, he told the host. His family members were among the thousands, now tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, killed in the ongoing genocidal assault on the tiny, densely populated strip where more than 2 million live besieged. My cousin Aya, her 2 children, her husband, her mother-in-law, and 2 other relatives died immediately, were killed instantly, and 2 of their youngest children, a twin, 2 years old, are now in intensive care, he said. Wait for this. The host replied, "Sorry for your own personal loss. I mean, can I just be clear, though? You cannot condone the killing of civilians in Israel, can you?" Such responses to our terrible losses, whether on the international stage or in the media, are not merely callous. They reveal a far more troubling truth. The standard, across industries, is to dehumanize the Palestinian. When television producers invite us to participate in their programs, they do not seek to interview us for our experiences or analysis or the context we can provide. They do not offer us their condolences the way they do our Israeli counterparts. They invite us to interrogate us. The former Director General of the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs called it waging a holistic campaign against the other side. Take him out of his comfort zone. Make him be on the defensive. Argumentum ad hominem. You discredit the messenger as a way of discrediting the message has long been an Israeli mantra. For our plight cannot be discredited, but our characters can be. They turn us into criminals of thought, guilty of our rage and grudges, of our natural responses to brutalization. They test our answers against the viewer's inherent bias. The bombs raining down on the besieged Gaza Strip become secondary, if not entirely irrelevant, to our televised trials. We die a lot as defendants. To illustrate, when the Israeli occupation forces killed 15-year-old Adam Ayad in Dashisha refugee camp in Bethlehem, which we talked about earlier, the question was, Did he really throw a Molotov cocktail at the soldiers? Aren't the Israelis known for fabricating such stories? When instead the question should have been, why are Israeli troops in Bethlehem in the first place? Why was Adam Ayad born in a refugee camp? Why is Molotov in the headline of a story about soldiers killing a boy? So what if he throws a Molotov cocktail? Who wouldn't? There's no question as to why he would be in that position. As if this is something that Palestinians do. They wake up, they're born, they grow up, and then one day they decide, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to throw a Molotov cocktail. In 2022, I tried to help my friend Ruah Rimawi publish an opinion essay about her late brothers, Jawad and Tafer Rimawi, two young Palestinian men shot by the occupation forces during a raid of their village, where the IOF has no business being. They were killed within minutes of each other. We pitched the story to The Guardian, The Washington Post, and The Los Angeles Times. We didn't try The New York Times. All publications refused or ignored the article. When we talked to a media expert about this, his opinion was that Ruah's article was not getting published because her brothers threw stones at the Israeli army, because they spent their last moments honorably defending their community against colonial violence. Resistance in their case meant something profane, disgraceful, not suitable for readers. Their victimhood was not a perfect victimhood, so they were not offered a spot in the LA Times. Here he's quoting Christian Amanpour. That the slaughter on October the 7th is the worst thing that could have happened, and that everybody has the right to live with rights and dignity, including the Palestinian people? She quickly clarifies, perhaps correcting herself, and I am not talking about Hamas. Through her resounding exclusion of Hamas from the category of those entitled to live with rights and dignity, Amanpour effectively suggests that the supposed Universal Declaration of Human Rights can be conditioned upon one's political affiliations. Why not focus on the sitting politicians describing Palestinians as savages that have to be eradicated? Politicians whose battle cries are finish them, level the place, and bounce the rubble in Gaza. Politicians who, when asked about our children, say with enthusiasm, we should kill them all. Examining the conversation between a liberal television anchor and a liberal author unveils the implicit underpinnings of their discourse. Palestinians must denounce certain affiliations, determined by the West, to be considered worthy of living. Or I should correct myself, worthy of condolences, as we are doomed regardless. Bombs do not discriminate on the basis of political ideology. They take the liberal and the radical, the Salafist and the secular, the communist and the capitalist, sometimes from under the same roof. When the sniper finds your bedroom in the scope of his rifle, he does not care whether the photograph beside your bed is of Nasrallah, Gandhi, or Haifa Webe. The photograph is only useful when your character is on trial. This is the tension in which we exist. In response to the bad guys saying that there are no innocents among us, the good guys will retort that indeed there are innocents if you look hard enough. You hear it everywhere. In White House press briefings, in the halls of the European Union, even in the paragraphs of an ally's impassioned op-ed, not all Palestinians are Hamas. And it is true that not all Palestinians support Hamas, but what is the implication of that argument? By distinguishing Palestinians from Hamas, or differentiating the supporters of the organization from its opponents, the members from the non-members, Amanpour, if I were to give her the benefit of the doubt, wanted to convince her Israeli guest of Palestinian humanity. But in her attempt to do so, it could be inferred that she implicitly condemned Hamas members and supporters to die. For when she insisted that she is not talking about Hamas, she pledged allegiance to the belief that underpins both Israeli and American societies across the political spectrum. Unless Palestinians perform a pre-approved socio-political disposition, one remains without an obligation to even pretend they are human. In other words, they must be tested in order for us to care. And if they don't pass every single test to our satisfaction, then we're allowed to not care. We're allowed to treat them as human animals. Once again, it is only through defanging, taking your fangs out, that the Palestinian can communicate and narrativize. no more than a marginal narrative, but a narrative nonetheless. The story of the Palestinian as human, like you and me, is a story that has sought to resituate the Palestinian in a world where he exists without narrative, or to be rigorous, a world where he is not self-authored and rather preceded by other people's definitions. This is particularly funny. Though the settler colony's Jewish character was no secret, we were still instructed to treat it as such, sometimes by our parents, other times by well-meaning solidarity activists. We were instructed to ignore the Star of David on the Israeli flag and to distinguish Jews from Zionists with surgical precision. This is something I've learned pretty early on in my journey, that I am not going to obsess about making that distinction, as if Zionists have nothing to do with Judaism, and Jews who don't speak up have nothing to do with Zionism. For me, it's a distinction without a difference, and people who obsess about it need to take a closer look at the issue. When my octogenarian grandmother addressed those foreign visitors, I corrected her and she says foreign visitors. These are people who are coming by to their home, which is half occupied by settlers. They're living in the other half of their house. When my octogenarian grandmother addressed those foreign visitors, I corrected her mid-sentence whenever she described the Jewish settlers in her house as, well, Jewish. And he's talking, this is his own programming. He's admitting to us that has even been pulled into this false parsing, that it's so important that we have to say this, as if that really matters at all, as if that's going to help solve the problem. If you just say that they're Zionists, then you don't mention anything about them actually being Jews also. I suspect that this explanation did nothing to assuage people's fury. Disclaimers of this sort often further implicate us in that of which we are accused, blowing smoke where there is no fire. While it is not materially the same as blowing oneself up in a bus or cafe, the argument went, it is only steps removed, a kind of gateway activity. And here he was commenting on the famous story about Edward Said throwing a rock towards the border, towards a guardhouse that wasn't occupied, and there was condemnation from some of his allies. And he's pointing out that, as he's pointing out throughout the book, not every single one of these accusations has to be answered, because it's always giving the benefit of doubt to the colonizer, to the occupier, to the murderer, to the rapist, instead of asking the Palestinians, well, what happened to you? And let's take that at face value. For the Arab in the West, the task is to carefully detonate presumptions or suffer their explosions. We must measurably show, before all else, our distance from the charges lodged at us. We need to prove, in the face of preposterous hostility, that we are respectable civilians, journalists, medics, and professors who are not like Hamas. One blunder is enough to give credence to the rumors that haunt us. If you're appreciating this content, consider hitting like, subscribe, sharing this video with others who might enjoy Mohammed's writing. It's very fine, as you can tell, and it's a free and easy way for you to support our work here on the channel. One tactic I find myself using often is reminding U.S. taxpayers that the Zionist regime receives an annual gift of billions of their dollars in the form of military aid. Emphasizing the subordinate clause that the weapons used to subjugate Palestinians are American-made is a sad attempt at refocusing the issue or beautifying my rationale. Most Americans might not think much of Palestinians, but their money is always on their mind. The list of tactics goes on, appealing to authority, emotion, purity, and keep in mind, Muhammad's accusing himself here. He is laying bare the silliness and the impurity of the tactic, but he has slipped into it himself. Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention says, imagine if this Palestinian kid was your kid. No true Jew would support Israel. Or intersectionality, highlighting police exchange programs, cyber warfare, climate change, the arms trade, tested on Palestinians, used in Kashmir. There are Christians in Gaza, and so on. Diplomatic maneuvers, sending delegations of children to speak to politicians, talking about your Israeli friends on international platforms, anti-Semitism disclaimers before every speech, security coordination, peace accords. And are any of these tactics winning tactics? Do they really matter? Here he's referencing the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh. Very infamously, her funeral cortege was attacked by the Israelis. Shouldn't be that surprising, but the video of it is shocking and instructive. Here he's pointing out that what instantly happened was the reference that she was a U.S. citizen. Because now that matters. If she was just some Palestinian journalist, who cares? But if she has a dark blue passport, you should care now. Her passport was the talking point. Shireen was an American, and her alleged Americanness swiftly made her human. That email was undoubtedly well-intentioned, but it felt like a slap in the face. The logic is straightforward. Certain citizenships can transform the slain, usually a number in a given statistic, into a person of blood and flesh, a victim worthy of sympathy. The bald eagle embossed on Shireen's travel documents would make her even more worthy. Though not one to turn the other cheek, she certainly fit the obligatory profile of a perfect victim. A 51-year-old woman, a Christian, a journalist who was killed while wearing a clearly marked press vest and helmet, and a foreign national. Americans might die by the rifle of a troubled teenager in school hallways, but very rarely by the rifles of a foreign army. Palestinians, on the other hand, are shot every day with impunity. Barely 3 weeks after Shireen's assassination, Gofran Warazne, a reporter from Hebron's Al-Arub refugee camp, was killed by the Israeli occupation forces as she was on her way to work. Despite being a journalist, her killing barely made a splash in the Arab world, let alone in the West. What did Rachel Corrie's Americanness give her outside of the uproar? Did it deliver justice for her family? Did it stop the bulldozer that crushed her from demolishing more homes? Do Americans murdered by Israeli settlers receive the same kind of state-sponsored grief as the Americans held hostage in Gaza? What did the hyphen in Omar Assad's nationality offer him beyond a spot in the headlines that otherwise ignore the unhyphenated? Did those headlines name the culprit, or was Assad just found dead? To give you some context as to who Omar was, Omar Assad was an 80-year-old Palestinian man who was killed during an Israeli raid in the village of Jiljilia on the outskirts of Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. Assad was stopped at 2:30 a.m. and forced out of his car, blindfolded, handcuffed, and dragged to a construction site. Left there by the IOF, he died of a heart attack. An 80-year-old man. When a passport becomes a political device for humanization, the pretext is to coax Western governments to seek justice on behalf of their citizens. But the subtext, more dangerously, more humiliatingly, is selling a narrative of innocence, a narrative that accepts the racist and xenophobic worldviews of the audience it attempts to persuade. In such ahistorical readings which obfuscate the power imbalance between the occupier and the occupied, the militant is evacuated outside of the context that gave rise to him or her in the first place. The newscaster is expected to present the killing of her siblings as if she were an unbiased observer, and the nurse whose patient is a beloved coworker maimed by an airstrike is expected to maintain professionalism, to not seek revenge on the drone operator. In this dimension, the Fidai reemerges as a figure that closely resembles the Zionist soldier, capable of committing war crimes against civilians in the heart of Tel Aviv. This, as Oruba Othman writes, obscures the fact that the armed militant is a victim who first inherits from his ancestors the conditions of dispossession, expulsion, and mutilation, and later transforms these abstractions into the motive force of decolonization. I want to pause for a moment to just go back to some of the phrases and some of the writing El-Kurd puts forward in this text, where I just marvel at how beautifully he expresses, and with an economy of words, he's able to compress what he's saying. He's either very gifted, and this is coming out as a first draft, or he's a very good editor, or he had a very good editor for this book, in which he's able to really say a lot in a little bit of space. Palestinians, regardless of their legal status and often because of their legal status, are told to despise themselves from the moment they begin observing their environment. We are nowhere in the atlas, our enemies gloat, and barely in the official archives. Our world is built by the settler, for the settler. Settler feels like too soft a word, too forgiving. Homicidal burglar is more apt. The settler holds the gavel, the baton, and boasts a divine decree. The settler controls our groundwater, seas, and rain, and bills us for them, even criminalizes our thirst. After drawing the borders, he now dominates the borders. He controls our roads and what passes through them. He can and does clog the arteries of our nation. After Refaat al-Arir was murdered alongside several members of his family in a targeted assassination in December 2023, I wrote in Arabic that I could not compose a tribute for Refaat in the Anglophone news site where I worked as a culture editor. To attempt to eulogize a Palestinian man in the colonizer's lexicon is to self-flagellate. They erase their crimes from the archives and erase us from the history books. They create nations with no natives in their dictionaries. Nations that pretend not to know whose blood it is on their hands. Announcing one's death requires extracting recognition of one's existence in the first place. English, the language engraved on the missiles that killed Refaat, converts the Palestinian funeral into an arena of strenuous persuasion and pedagogy, where there are no givens or objective facts. If you'd like to see some of Dr. Al-Arir's work, I've done a review on Palestine Writes Back, which was a collection he curated with some of his students. I'll put a link to that in the description as well as a card. We are implored to be peaceful or submissive and forbearing, and we are tolerated when we are. We are meek, and we shall inherit no earth. What we are not allowed is the future. We cannot be ambitious or cunning. We cannot aspire to sovereignty or revenge. We are robbed of the right to complexity, to contradictory feelings, the right to contain multitudes. Our sadness is without teeth. Perhaps we can be bitter, but belligerence and hostility, foreign concepts to our oppressors apparently, exile us outside of humanity once more. The only thing we are permitted to look forward to is the day's end. Is disproving libel the sole reason we roam this earth? In the hotel room, as I recounted Ahmed's story to my friend, I mentioned his voluntary disavowal of anti-Semitism and the conversation that followed in the pub, a conversation that has haunted me for months. What got under my skin was not only the demand that we exhibit an extraordinarily docile disposition in the face of colonial brutality, but the implication that Ahmed's contempt would have disqualified him as a victim. It was also the strange fact that the hatred we supposedly possess, lurking within our hearts, receives more concern than the nuclear arsenal of our colonizers. Let us consider again the violence visited upon Ahmed, the insurmountable, suffocating sorrow one is bound to feel after a loss of such devastating proportion. 21 of your kin slain at once. What becomes of you when words no longer suffice, when sorrow loses its potency, and when suffocation loosens its grip? What becomes of the 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza whose calendars are marked by routine bombardments? What are the mental and muscular consequences of being forced to transform a taxi into a hearse? What becomes of the nurse whose shift is interrupted by the arrival of her husband's corpse on a stretcher? What about the father wandering with what remains of his son in 2 plastic bags? What happens to him after all of this death, once he is alone and away from the cameras? What kind of man will the boy carrying his brother's limbs in a bag grow up to be? And all of those, Muhammad didn't just make those cases up. He knows these are real stories, and he simply anonymized them to make a rhetorical point. But all of these things have happened. I once credulously believed that our testimonies would be considered credible only once we attained respectability. Colonial logic gaslights us to believe that it is our shortcomings, not colonialism itself, that stand between us and liberation. And so we spend our years on a circuitous journey toward an impossible atonement. We accept starting the story at secondly. But in truth, and to state the obvious, nothing renders me killable. Before I threw the rock, they stole my land. Before I picked up the rifle, they shot my loved ones. Before I made the makeshift rocket, they put me in a cage. What I read cannot be used as a pretext to kill me, even if I filled my library with books written by psychopaths, interchangeably stacking copies of Mein Kampf and Hillary Clinton's Hard Choices. These days I am haunted by a subtler, though deadlier refrain, an unwanted realization. Gaza has the right to forsake us, to never forgive us, to spit in our faces. How many wars has it confronted? How many martyrs has it given? How many bodies were stolen from it, snatched from their father's embrace? And how many of us stutter when asked about resistance, or disavow our right to resist entirely, our need to resist? How many of us choose our careers over our kin? How many of us could have done something, anything, and did not? And I love that Muhammad is willing to, once again, accuse himself. He does that throughout the vulnerability he displays, and the willingness to admit, I was wrong here, I'm learning, is something all of us could benefit from. He also takes a moment to point out Western hypocrisy regarding Ukraine. In the same month that Ruah was trying to publish her brother's story, which we talked about before, her two brothers that were killed and were throwing rocks in their final moment, so the LA Times and other people were not interested in their story. The LA Times ran a headline that read, Kyiv civilians take up arms to fight Russian attack on Ukraine. Civilians. The Washington Post printed a similar headline. The Guardian profiled Ukraine's student Molotov cocktail makers. The New York Post published an article with a headline praising a heroic Ukrainian suicide bomber. Sky News broadcast what can essentially be described as a Molotov-making workshop. Civilians help make Molotov cocktails to take on Russian forces. The New York Times interviewed a psychologist who advised that anger and hate, in the context of occupation, is a normal reaction and important to validate, stating that such hate should be channeled into something useful, like making incendiary bombs. It's okay for the Ukrainians to do it because Russians are bad and Ukrainians are good. Can't be said about the Israelis. And there's this intellectual dissonance, inability to see this double standard. Quoting the New York Times, these practices mean that Hamas is responsible for many of the civilian deaths, according to international law. But it gloats that the Amnesty International report accusing the Ukrainian military of violating international laws and risking civilian lives by operating in hospitals, residential neighborhoods, and schools was met with widespread and almost universal condemnation. Oh, we can't let Amnesty International say anything bad about the Ukrainians. Your conclusion as a reader of the Times is as follows. Ukrainians go to war in the concrete jungle because they, unlike Palestinians, have fewer and fewer options when it comes to where they locate their forces. Ukraine is defending itself against a Russian army that has vastly more firepower. But Hamas's tactics, in the most densely populated place on earth, explain why Israel has been forced to strike so much civilian infrastructure, kill so many Palestinians, and detain so many civilians. What's interesting is I don't even think the press is reflective enough to know or to even detect this double standard. When the Zionists burned our people alive in their tents in Rafah, a sentence I thought I would never write, the massacre was only interrupted by commercial breaks. Their choir sang the same old tune, straight out of the playbook. At first they denied it, then they said it was a misfired rocket, then they said it was a precision attack on a military leader who was hiding among civilians, then they said the number of martyrs was fabricated, then they said it was a tragic mistake. Can never admit to it. They take joy in killing Palestinians, but they try to lie their way out of what they're doing, even though they do it with joy, with glee. In February 2023, the Chelsea and Westminster Hospital in London succumbed to pressure from the Zionist group UK Lawyers for Israel and took down a display of artworks by Palestinian schoolchildren. According to the organization, which was delighted by the outcome, the complaint to the hospital was made on behalf of a number of Jewish patients who hilariously, infuriatingly said they felt vulnerable and victimized by the display. Salaried adults. Nothing evades the Zionist backlash, not the most docile of children's books, nor painted ceramic plates created by children in Gaza. Neither do the decorated academics, nor do I. The Israeli regime's architecture of displacement uses many different methods, but all have a single goal: to control as much land as possible while keeping as few Palestinians as possible, without triggering international alarm bells, be it through manufacturing real estate disputes, demolishing homes built without authorization, stealing lands by declaring them military zones, archaeological sites, environmentally protected, or state-owned, or simply by stunting the growth of Palestinian communities by isolating them and severing their social and economic ties with neighboring towns. The Zionist project has always created narratives to legalize and justify replacing the native with settler. A settler in Palestine will make a film about other, worse settlers who laugh as they testify about Tantura. We've done a film club review on that. I'll put a link in the description as well as a card. Where they buried our ancestors in mass graves, a massacre we have narrated for decades with visceral recollection, in our movies, in our novels and songs, in our oral histories. On other occasions, it is remorse that takes them to the confession booth. A soldier suffers a pang of conscience and decides to break his silence, after a long career of maiming children or hunting protesters for sport. He comes clean, under legal immunity, of course, about all the heinous acts he has committed in our towns and refugee camps. He cannot sleep, he has PTSD, so naturally, he embarks on a speaking tour across universities, where he is met with applause and platitudes. He professes his sins in the confessional of a brightly lit stage, and the audience, unscathed, entertained, grants him a plenary indulgence. What courage! I am going to take a bit of an aside here to point out that Mohammed is perhaps being a little hard here insofar as there's nothing else that an Israeli soldier could do. If an Israeli soldier does realize that he's done something wrong, the very least he can do is try to speak up for it. I would say that breaking the silence is doing something better than nothing. But I do understand, and I'm not taking away from what Mohammed's point is here, and he's being consistent all the way through the book, that this isn't the great thing that we should laud, that this is the least that we should expect. And I'll put a link to a book that I reviewed in this vein by Avi Cohen about his own journey and his work for breaking the silence. I'll put a link in the description as well as a card. So I wouldn't say I'm disagreeing with Mohammed. I'm simply putting a footnote to what he's saying, that this should be applauded, but as he points out, it should still be a bare minimum expectation. Why do we give the authority of narration to those who have murdered and displaced us, when the scarcity of their guilt means honesty is unlikely? Why do we wait for those carrying the batons to confess, when our bruised bodies tell the whole truth? A beautiful, tragic sentence there. Mohammed references a documentary called Arna's Children, which I'm hoping to take a look at some point. Arna's Children is a documentary chronicling the lives of Palestinian children in the Jenin refugee camp and their involvement in a local theater group started by Arna Mer Kamis. Some of these children grew to become Palestinian resistance fighters. The documentary intersperses their childhood in the theater with them taking up arms as adults and eventually their martyrdom. This is a long passage I'm going to read, but I think it's worth hearing it as a whole. One of the film's protagonists is Zakaria Zubeidi, whose mother and brother were shot dead by the occupation forces during the Battle of Jenin. He is a former member of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade and one of Arna's children. In 2021, he, among 5 others, participated in the legendary prison break from the maximum security Gilboa prison. In an old interview of his that has resurfaced, Zubeidi tells the camera, "I want my son to be educated, to live a life better than the one I live. I would love for him to obtain scientific degrees, to become a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer. That is my dream. And I will work to achieve it, but the Israelis have to first allow my child to grow up." His son, Mohammed Zubeidi, went on to join the resistance. On September the 5th, 2024, at just 21 years old, Mohammed, alongside 4 others, was killed by the Israeli military during an incursion in Tubas, in the occupied West Bank. The very moment that the Palestinian exits the womb, he is unchilded, flung away from childhood by a machinery that exists everywhere and always, and treated as both a good-for-nothing nobody and a dangerous ticking bomb at once. The Palestinian is unchilded the first time he talks to his uncle from behind glass, or asks his aunt about the tin roofs, or tries to decipher what has been erased from the street signs, or when he embraces his father by a concrete cylinder, telling himself that the explosions he is hearing are just fireworks, or when he plays soccer on the beach. Somewhere along the line, the Palestinian child will stumble across the phrase, "legally killed child," used to describe his slain peers. A Yale professor will write a column in The Atlantic about how it is possible to kill children legally, and the sniper follows orders. The Palestinian is unchilded the first time she passes the checkpoint on her way to school and feels the weight of a stranger's hand under her shirt, the first time she sits next to her classmate's empty desk, leaving her yet another rose, or when she takes the bus home and looks outside the window to see another schoolgirl in a coagulating pool. She is exiled from childhood the first time she asks about the black ribbon on her mother's photograph, or why the neighbors weep when they congratulate. The first time she skips rocks across a sea of chemo green, or douses a piece of cloth before stuffing it down a bottleneck, or when she feels the steel cocoon becoming a butterfly inside her knee. The first time the Palestinian boy hears the banging of the gavel, or feels the coldness of steel on his small wrists, he is forced into adulthood. He watches his reflection in a pool of spit. He finds gray in his hair. He grows under the moon of fluorescent lighting, coming of age in the interrogation room. I mean, it's just, the writing is astonishing. He is delivering these heartbreaking and beautiful insights in stunning prose. Sometimes I don't have much more to add than that. I don't want to take away from the purity of it. I just want you to hear it and feel it for yourself. And if I haven't convinced you by now that you should buy the book, you should. It's not even very long. A couple hundred pages. When Palestinians finally arrive in these works, on the screen or on the page, we are represented as victims, not as protagonists or complex characters. We are not history makers. History stomps on our bodies. Our resistance is obscured, our lineages defaced. We offer our blood and bruises as evidence, reporting our calamities without commentary to support the author's thesis. We become their objects, curated into context-free exhibitions, editorialized to wallow unintelligibly. So some final excerpts I'll read for you. I hear the phrase, "we must honor our martyrs," but what does it look like to truly honor them? Witnessing, whatever that may mean, is not enough, at least not on its own. Nor is it enough to honor them with discursive lullabies and empty pseudo-radical slogans. I am repeatedly reminded of the late Bassel al-Raj's words, "If you want to be an intellectual, you have to be engaged." Though I am inclined to argue the Arabic word for engaged, mushtabik, carries a much more militant connotation. If you don't want to be engaged, if you don't want to confront oppression, your role as an intellectual is pointless. The rallying cry that we are all Palestinians must abandon the metaphor and manifest materially, meaning all of us, Palestinians or otherwise, must embody the Palestinian condition, the condition of resistance and refusal, in the lives we lead and the company we keep. Meaning, we reject our complicity in this bloodshed and our inertia when confronted with all of that blood. Meaning, Gaza cannot stand alone in sacrifice. The late Wali Daka once said in an interview, "I do not want to return to the Palestine of the past, mandatory Palestine, where the cactus, pomegranates, and watermills are, because simply it exists only in memory. When Palestine becomes romantic, the right of return becomes utopian, and this romanticization of return distances us from return itself. I want to return to the Palestine of the future, in which the collective national identity must mirror the geography of the entire homeland. The Oslo Accords gave up part of the homeland in exchange for the state, and its signatories replaced return with the story of return. Return in this sense was folkloric. This linguistic swelling expresses the inability to liberate the prisoners, so in this sense I long for the homeland, or the memory that we will create. I long for the future, for the home I will build. There I will rearrange memory in a place of my choosing." I mean, what a wonderful compliment to the stories from Murid al-Barghouti or Hassan Kanafani, hearkening to the Palestine of the past. He longs for the Palestine of the future. What a beautiful sentiment. And here are the last lines of the book. I'm going to leave it with his mother's. His mother has the last lines of the book. "As deadly and treacherous and unrelenting as it is, the Nakba will not last forever. The world is changing because it must. If seeds can germinate in the inferno, so can revolution. On the phone, my mother tells me, rain is coming and God is almighty." Thank you. Thanks to Mohammed's mom for finishing this wonderful book. Not a perfect book, but a wonderful book nevertheless. And thank you, Mohammed, for bringing this to us so soon, you could say, after the most recent round of violence. The fact that he was able to put this together in 2025, I think is really helpful, so that we're not just stunned by the violence of that 2023 to 2025 period, and which is still ongoing now as Israel continues to break ceasefires. But it's important to fill in that space, that we're not just sitting there in horror from what happened, but voices like Mohammed's are immediately bringing us back into focus and looking at the real issues here. And I think this book does a wonderful job. It fills a need. There's not a book like it that's really been on the landscape, not only because of the currency of it, the recentness of it, but because of what he's really doing, which is not only critiquing outsiders' help, but even critiquing himself as a Palestinian, critiquing other Palestinians. It's a helpful, useful book. I really can't recommend it strongly enough. One way you can support this channel is by buying a copy. You can also support Mohammed by doing so. There'll be a link in the description. Hit like, subscribe, share this. That's a free and easy way you can support his message and the work of this channel. If you'd like to give a special thanks for this video in particular, there are links to PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee below. If you'd like to support us on an ongoing basis, there's a link to Patreon, YouTube membership, where you'll get early access to videos like this one, as well as have a chance to get exclusive content that we don't put here on YouTube or on other platforms, and have a chance to talk with me about books like this and other ones that I read but are not necessarily up on the channel. A reminder that once this channel gets monetized, any profits that we receive are going to go towards the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which helps Palestinian children get medical care that they could not otherwise get. And if you'd like to nominate a book for the future, go to my Amazon wish list below. There are books for both channels, both my main Stephen Heiner channel and this channel, Palestine Bookshelf. So you'll see different titles when you're on there. But if you see one on Palestine, you can buy it, send it my way, and I will put it in the queue to review. Until next time, enjoy your reading.